Shopify is a platform built for growth, whether you're just starting out or already running a thriving business. From managing inventory to creating a seamless checkout experience, Shopify is designed to handle it all. And it doesn't stop there. Shopify helps you sell everywhere your customers are, online or in person. It's the ultimate tool for turning big dreams into big wins. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/OPP.
Mochi Health is here to help you start your weight loss journey with caring, personalized support. Meet one-on-one with board-certified obesity doctors and registered dietitians who truly listen and understand your unique needs. Eligible patients can access affordable GLP-1 medications delivered right to their door each month. No insurance? No problem. Mochi Health accepts FSA and HSA, making care accessible and affordable. And with 24/7 customer service, you'll never feel alone on your path to better health. Get started with Mochi Health today. Take the free quiz at joinmochi.com and use code AUDIO40 at checkout for $40 off your first month of membership. That's joinmochi.com with promo code AUDIO40.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, a horrific murder becomes an unparalleled legend. We investigate the real Amityville Horror. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined with my unparalleled co-host, Alice.
Hey, Brett, how are you?
Doing well. You see how I tied that into the first part there?
I saw what you did. That was great, except that you used unparalleled for like a tragic, multi-murder to describe me. So thanks for that.
I think that's the ultimate true crime compliment.
That's true.
Isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, like you're the Ted Bundy of co-hosts.
Oh my gosh. This is getting off to a dark start.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Thanks.
And sorry, guys, if this is echoey. I don't know if it is yet because I can't really hear on my headphones whether it is, but I am currently in a hotel room while the final repairs on my house. You guys may recall a tree fell on my house a few months ago, and we are in the final stages of repairs, but this stage required me to move out. So my wife and I and the baby are in a sort of long-term stay hotel, but I brought the podcast stuff with me so we could continue to record.
You guys, Brett is so committed. You have no idea. I don't even think he brought clothes or his toothbrush. He only brought his podcast equipment.
I actually did forget my toothbrush. I have to go back and get it.
I'm so sorry to hear that. But thanks for brushing your teeth, I guess. I have to say, for those who may have forgotten or are joining us later, when the tree came crashing through Brett's roof during a horrendous storm, the podcast equipment was fatefully saved, and now it's moved into a hotel room.
Yeah, it's the traveling podcast equipment. And it was saved, as if by the grace of God, saved. And my second concern after my family, very quickly on the heels of that, though, was the podcast equipment.
Well, I'm really happy your house is finally getting put back together. It's been a long time coming.
It has been. This has been a long ordeal. The tree fell on the house on Easter, so I should let you know. You know, when you're trying to do sort of major construction during the time of COVID, it's not easy. So just a great year, 2020. But it was the year of our podcast. That's the only good thing I can really say about 2020. So I'm going to hold on to that.
It's so true.
And speaking of the podcast, today we're continuing our October exploration of the bizarre and the spooky and the maybe paranormal. We did a ghost ship last week. Hope you guys enjoyed that one. And we had a lot of fun with that. That was sort of a goofy podcast episode. Well, we're getting back to the depressing stuff today because this time we have a mass murder. Yay.
I don't know what the proper response is for that.
Yeah, I don't either. And it's not just any mass murder. It's a mass murder that became famous for other reasons. This is the story of the real Amityville Horror. Now, many of you, I'm sure all of you, have heard of the Amityville Horror. You may be able to picture the house in your mind. It was used prominently in advertisements for that movie and the many sequels and remakes. I think Ryan Reynolds even did a Amityville Horror movie. So, there you go. It was one of his first big roles, I guess. In any event, a lot of you have heard of it. A lot of you know about it. You know about the haunting, the famous haunting of the house in Amityville. But what you may not know is the true story, depending on what you believe or don't believe about that haunting. But one thing that absolutely happened there before that haunting occurred was a horrific murder, the murder of an entire family. And there was only one survivor, the oldest son. And that's the story we're going to tell you today. So for those of you who've heard about the Amityville Horror, the haunting, you've probably heard of the Lutz family. And they thought they were getting the deal of a lifetime, $80,000 for a 3-story, 5-bedroom house in the quiet Long Island town of Amityville, with a pool and a boathouse and on the water for $80,000. Even in December 1975 dollars, that was quite a steal. And that had to make them wonder why. And the real estate broker, I'm sure they were thrilled to hear they were interested. The house had been on the market for 13 months. And obviously, when you're presented with that kind of deal, it's time to ask questions. Because usually, if something seems like it's too good to be true, it is. And they did ask questions. And to her credit, the real estate broker was completely honest with them. Because the house had a history.
And boy, what a history, Brett. It was 6:30 on November 13th, 1974, when Ronald DeFeo Jr., his friends called him Butch, burst into Henry's bar in the quiet seaside town of Amityville, New York. He was wild-eyed and he begged for help. His parents, he said, had been shot. But when the police arrived at the house on 112 Ocean Avenue, they found an unimaginable scene. Not only had the 2 adults been shot, but so, too, had DeFeo's 2 younger brothers and 2 younger sisters. All told, Ronald DeFeo Sr., who was 44, his wife, Louise, who was 42, along with their children, Dawn, who was 18, Allison, who was 13, Mark, who was 12, and John Matthew, age 9, were all dead.
And this was the kind of thing that didn't happen in a place like Amityville. Amityville was the kind of place that you went to get away from these kind of horrors, to escape the kind of things you might see in the city. It truly was a quiet seaside town, and they'd never seen anything like this. But it was only going to get weirder. All 6 victims were found in their beds, and all 6 victims were found face down. None of the victims had been moved. None of the victims appeared to have attempted to rise and defend themselves at any point during the killing, although some have suggested that both Louise and Allison were awake when killed. Butch DeFeo fired a total of 8 shots from a .35 caliber lever-action rifle called a Marlin 336C. One of the things that's sort of frustrating about this case There should be a lot of documentation. This case is old, and it's obviously generated a lot of attention, and yet you would be surprised how hard it is to get hold of police reports, autopsy reports, that sort of thing. It would be nice if someone actually undertook a real investigation of this case, because you hear things like that Butch would have had to have reloaded the weapon at least once. And that's actually not true. One police report I was able to find stated that the weapon had been modified so that it would hold, I believe, 12 shots. So if that's the case, then he would not have had to reload it. Make of that what you will. But what's definitely true is that each shot of this rifle was so loud that later tests indicated it could be heard at least a mile away. Despite that, it appears that no one inside the house or outside the house heard the shots, though neighbors reported hearing the sound of a dog howling. Suspicion immediately fell on the only surviving member of the family, Butch.
So, to set the scene further, Brett, you said that the rifle shots could be heard a mile around. How close was the nearest neighbor? Were they in the middle of a field, kind of in a rural area, or did they have neighbors close by?
No, they had neighbors very close by. In fact, the next door neighbor's house ended up being the sort of de facto war room for the police after they discovered this. This is a neighborhood, pretty close community. It's on the water, very desirable area. So this is not somebody in the middle of a rural area or on a farm or far away from their nearest neighbors. It's frankly inexplicable that no one heard these shots, because as I said, people did report hearing the dog.
Yeah, and especially 6 shots, right? I don't know if you've ever been woken up by, say, fireworks. I've been woken up, and if it's already gone, I wonder, what woke me up, and maybe I'll fall back asleep. But 6 shots, especially if they're all in their individual beds, it's not like they're all in one room, and you could do 6 quick shots, right? They had to at least have been...
It's actually 8.
Oh, 8.
Because he used 2 shots on the parents, each.
There you go. I mean, it would have taken time to walk from bed to bed to bed. And so for no one to have heard gunshots is eerie, to say the least.
And it's one of those things people point to, and it's something we're going to talk about several times as we go through this case, the sort of very unusual circumstance that would allow not only people outside the house, but remember, it appears that no one inside the house heard the shots, got up, investigated, anything like that. They're all in their bed. They're all lying face down. They're all shot essentially in the back and the head.
Now, when you say face down, do they think that they were sleeping face down or that they fell over, slumped over?
So they think they were sleeping. None of them were moved. So based on the bullet entry, the blood, the bleeding, it all matches up, if you understand what I'm saying. It appears that they literally were laying in bed and were shot. The only 2 who might have been awake, according to the police, were the mother and the younger sister. It's never explained exactly what made them think they might have been awake. It could be something like you're suggesting, where they're sort of like stirring or beginning to rise and then they're shot. But no, nothing more than that. No more movement than that.
Okay, so you said that suspicion fell on the only surviving member, Butch. So he was understandably interviewed. And in initial interviews, DeFeo claimed that he and his father were close. They argued often, but his father was always there for him. Butch has claimed that he and his mother were very close, and that he was close to his sisters and brothers as well. Childhood friends said that the father was abusive, but that Butch seems either to be in denial about that or just not willing to admit it. DeFeo now says that his father was violent and abusive from the day he was born and often threw him across the room, leading to head injuries.
And we're going to see this again and again, how often he changes his story.
Yeah, I mean, his story, it couldn't be more different.
Right. And just get used to it, because his story changes so much. And you can understand it changing from the initial story when he's still presenting himself as completely innocent. But it gets even weirder than that. And it's really hard to credit anything he says.
And to have such wildly different stories. Now, so far we've only talked about, potential abuse as a child. But like Brett says, you're going to see how his story about every aspect of his life and what happens in and around the time of these murders is just ping-ponging back and forth with no rhyme or reason. So according to these initial interviews, DeFeo says that the day before the murders, he was constantly high on heroin, and he'd also been drinking excessively. The police stated that he told them he'd used heroin after the murders, but not before. Now, according to friends, DeFeo would often go down into the cellar, shoot up, and pass out. That's pretty intense, by the way, especially when you have so many younger brothers and sisters in the house. I mean,
yeah, and this is just so, it's just funny. I mean, he's a pathological liar is one way to describe him. He tells the police on the one hand, oh, I didn't use heroin before the murders, I used it after the murder. Then later on, he tells them, oh, no, I was on heroin the whole time. I can barely remember anything that happened. And that seems to be more consistent with what his friend said he would do, that essentially he'd go to work, he worked, and that after that, he was in the basement, he was shooting up heroin, he was essentially just not even connected to the family. And I think if you're trying to decide, did he use heroin before or not, the answer is he used heroin before.
Yeah, and the way he's talking is consistent with someone who may not remember things or has been strung out a lot. DeFeo claimed that he would black out and that in the weeks leading up to the murders, he was blacking out more and more, and he couldn't remember a lot. DeFeo even told his lawyer that the night of the murders, he woke up at around 3:15 in the morning, and he could hear his family conspiring against him, planning to kill him. And he says it was at this time that a woman dressed in a hood with black hands appeared before him, handing DeFeo a rifle. DeFeo said that the voices from the house told him to kill. I mean,
that's creepy.
Just... So, I mean, we're attorneys. If you had someone tell you that, what would you do?
Well, I think I would definitely
get
go
a
for the
mental
insanity
consult.
defense. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'd get a mental consult.
Is, it's almost like some sort of weird twist on the Arthurian legend, right? Like the Lady in the Lake gives Arthur Excalibur, and in this one, you have this hooded woman with black hands giving him the rifle and then telling him to go off and kill. Or like The Shining, it has all the feeling of sort of a traditional horror story. You said if you heard this from your client, you would immediately seek a mental consult. In the years that have passed, DeFeo, one of the stories he's told, and he's told a lot of stories, is that his lawyer essentially decided, we're going for the insanity defense. When you kill 6 members of your family, crazy's about the only thing you got. And when he tells that story, he makes it sound like all of this, it wasn't that he told his lawyer that and his lawyer said, you're crazy. It was more the lawyer said, you need to be crazy. And this is what he came up with. And if you look at, and we'll post some links to this stuff, there are lots of interviews with Butch DeFeo. I mean, you can watch interviews of him all day long. He's told this story a lot of times. It's never the same story. There's also some transcripts from his parole hearings. And you'll see this in the parole hearings. He'll talk about this. And the parole hearings are interesting because, he's trying to get out of jail. You can read these things. At some point, we're going to go through all this. We're going to give you our views on it. But this really is the kind of thing you just have to make up your own mind about what you think happened here, what you think's true, what you think he made up whole cloth, what you think was in his head, how much it's mental illness, how much of it was the heroin. It's hard to say. Now, there's going to be some things we talk about that are kind of interesting about this. But for now, yes, to give you sort of the timeline on this stuff about the black hands and the hood, that's once he has his lawyer. So the initial story is he didn't have anything to do with it. He has this great relationship with his father. You can read his handwritten statement that he gives to the police at the very beginning, where he sort of pushes this off on some people who he may have had some bad interactions with, who may have had some connections to the mob. We'll talk about the mob some more in a second. That's his first thing. Then when he meets with his lawyer, it's the lady with the black hands. It's the voices telling him to kill. In between those two, though, there's the first conversation he has with the police. And if you're looking for a part of the story that might have the ring of truth, I think it's this part. After it's clear that nobody's buying his story, that he wasn't involved, and that his father was like a great person, he begins to tell, I think, probably what is closer to the truth. He tells the police that he had caught his mother having an affair. Now, I've never seen any confirmation of that fact. I've never seen any confirmation she was having an affair, but that's what he says. He says that his father was forcing him to get out of the house and work. He says that his father was abusive, that he and his father would often get into physical altercations. He has elaborated on that in the years since. He now claims that his father broke either a pool cue or a broomstick over his head a couple days before the murders. Now, what he has never done, and he didn't do it in the beginning, and he hasn't done it really in any of his subsequent stories about what happened, he's never given a reason why he had a problem with his brothers and his sisters, specifically his two younger brothers and his youngest sister. We're going to talk a lot about Don. Don was the 18-year-old, and he talks a lot about Don, but there's never been an explanation for why those three kids had to die. And the police have essentially concluded that it was one of those things where you kill two people. If you're going to cover up the crime, you need to kill everybody else, that no witnesses, right? And that's why he did it. Now, he did tell the police that he believed his father had a cash box full of money in the house. The police found this cash box, but there was no money in it. There was no cash in it. It's possible he'd already stolen it. It's possible he was just wrong about that. Police speculated that DeFeo wanted to fund his drug habit, and at some point he did ask the police about how he would go about collecting the life insurance policy that his father had, an unusual thing to do right after your family's been found murdered. For those of you who think it's strange that you would murder your entire family to fund your drug habit, I have had two different death penalty cases where in one case, son killed his parents so he could go on a bender, basically killed his parents, robbed the house. They found him a few days later, high out of his mind, essentially. The other one, guy killed his grandparents, same reason. Killed his grandparents, stole his grandparents' money, and I think pawned their lawnmower. So there's nothing that, as crazy as this is, and as terrible as this is, it's not that unusual, unfortunately. So if your theory is he did this to fund his drug habit, that's probably what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you, Brett, can we talk more about his relationship? So clearly he was over 18 and he still lived at home. Did he have a job? How was he funding his heroin habit? And did his parents know about it?
I think he worked at a garage, maybe. And he actually went to work this day, right? So he says the murder started about 3:15 in the morning. Most people think that's true. He does this. He then goes to work, and then he comes back and, quote unquote, finds the bodies and then goes to report it. So he did have a job, and he was using that, at least partially, to fund his habit.
And do you know if his parents knew about this drug habit?
That's hard to say.
I don't see how they could. I don't see how they could not at least suspect it, right? Heroin is it's hard to hide heroin. You may be able to hide pot smoking, otherwise, actually, it stinks pretty badly, but you might be able to get away with something like that. You might be able to get away with taking certain types of prescription pills, but heroin has such an effect, and like you said, you often pass out from it, that I can't imagine they didn't at least suspect that he had a serious drug issue.
I think they probably did. They knew that he drank a lot. He was drinking a lot. He had a really bad reputation around town. This is not one of those where when the police started to point the finger at him, a lot of the neighbors and the people around town were saying, oh, no, that's impossible. He would never do that. It was more like, oh, yeah, that makes total sense. So he had a reputation around town. Now, he did not have a long criminal record. In fact, I think he only had one prior for some sort of petty larceny. I mean, just a like small-time, shoplifting or something like that. So it wasn't like he'd committed a bunch of crimes, but he was known to be sort of an angry guy who was drunk a lot. It's possible the fact that he drank so much and was constantly drunk. I think at one point he says he was drinking like a fifth of scotch a day. Maybe that hit it. Maybe his parents just assumed he's just always drunk. He was not spending a lot of time with them. I don't think they really wanted to spend a lot of time with him. I don't think there was a lot of efforts at having an intervention with Junior to try and get him off the drugs or whatever he was doing. So I don't know for sure that they knew, but I bet they had pretty strong suspicions or they were in a pretty deep sense of denial.
And here's another question I think that helps set the scene. We've described Butch pretty well in terms of, he was a guy in town that people knew him to be volatile and someone who's possibly capable of such horrendous crimes. What about his family? Typically it wouldn't be surprising if someone came from a family where the parents were also drug users. The whole family kind of had issues. But is that the type of family he came from?
So I don't know that any of them had drug issues. Now, it's kind of funny if you watch the old documentaries on this, these sort of wonderful prejudice and stereotypes that are on display by the folks who talk about this. They're described at times, and I'm sure many of you with Italian families will be offended by this, as sort of the typical Italian family, whereas the father yelled at him, he yelled back, everybody yelled at each other, everybody was arguing, everybody hated each other, the kids are always fighting, the parents are always fighting, violence was not unusual, and that was sort of the chaotic, violent environment that he grew up in. This was not, I don't think this was a stable, loving family environment. It wasn't that. This is not one where it's inexplicable or he was an outlier. I think it was dysfunctional. And, they always say that kids who grow up in violence often will act violently at some point. And that appears to be what happened here. So in any event, once DeFeo had sort of admitted his involvement in this, he was able to direct the police to the rifle that had been used in this crime, which he had thrown into the bay, inlet, water, whatever you want to call it, right behind the house. And the police were able to recover this weapon. He was also able to direct them to some bloody clothes, which he dumped in a storm drain in Brooklyn. I think he worked in Brooklyn. I could be wrong about that. But in any event, he was able to show them where those clothes were. So, to the extent there's any question that he had some involvement in this, and there have been a lot of conspiracy theories about what happened that night, it's certainly the case that he had knowledge about where some stuff that had obviously been involved in this case was located. Just real quick to follow up on what Alice was saying, I'll give you a quick timeline here, pretty short, because everything happened pretty fast. So November 13th, 1974, 3:15 a.m., DeFeo kills his family. He then goes to work, as we said. Then the next day, the same day, I guess, he reports his family murdered at 6 p.m. by running into a bar and saying that his parents had been shot. He had some friends at that bar. They came back with him. They called the police, and he put on the full show. They say he was in the front yard sobbing. The police initially put him into protective custody. There were a lot of concerns at the time that this involved the mob. We're going to talk about that later. That this somehow was some sort of mob-related attack, and that maybe the only reason Butch was alive, and I guess this would be true, is that he wasn't there at the time. That if he had been there, he would be dead too.
Are you feeling stuck in your career or lacking employment at the moment? Experiencing symptoms of job dissatisfaction? You might be suffering from a common condition known as career stagnation. But don't worry, there's a solution. Monster.com. Monster.com offers a comprehensive suite of career-boosting tools designed just for you. Our free resume review and AI interview prep tool will help you stand out from the crowd. Need more guidance? Dive into our career advice articles for expert tips and insights. And don't forget to check out our salary tools to ensure you're getting paid what you're worth. Side effects may include a new job, increased confidence, and a brighter future. Consult Monster.com today and take the first step towards your new career. Ready for your next job opportunity? Visit Monster.com now.
This is your before and after story, where your first steps towards a new life-changing career begin. Southeastern College can take you there. We offer in-demand hybrid and online programs with hands-on training, led by in-field career professionals, and career services to put you on the path to a rewarding and fulfilling future. This is where your transformation begins. Southeastern College, your future is bright. Visit sec.edu to get started.
And then fast forward, like we said, 13 months. The Lutzes buy the house in December 1975, and less than 30 days later, they flee the residence, claiming a horrific haunting.
And the haunting is a whole nother story.
Right. And it really, I mean, you can't talk about this. You can't really separate the two, right? And if it hadn't been for the Amityville Horror, maybe you could. But once all that happened, this became the cause célèbre for every psychic and ghost hunter and parapsychologist in America at the time. And we're going to talk about some of that too.
Yeah, since you mentioned parapsychologists, let's talk about Hans Holzer. So Holzer was an Austrian-American parapsychologist, and along with the Warrens, he's perhaps one of the most famous ghost hunters of the 20th century, a term that he actually claims to have coined. Do you have thoughts on that? Did he actually coin ghost hunting?
It's a good question. Hans is an interesting guy. If you watch any of the documentaries on the murders of the DeFeos, he pops up at some point. Really interesting that you can be a parapsychologist. He actually taught parapsychology at one of the New York universities. Look, he's a very smart guy. He studied in Austria. He saw the Nazis coming and fled. He ended up at Columbia, where he got a degree. He then got his doctorate in parapsychology. It was a weird time, the early 20th century. And then he would teach it. He spoke Japanese, very smart guy. And he had a lot of theories about the paranormal and ghost hunting in general. I don't know that he coined it. I actually looked into this because I was interested in this question too. There were other people who had used that before, but he seems to be the guy who really sort of brought it into common parlance. He's kind of like Christopher Columbus, right? Christopher Columbus didn't discover the New World, but when he discovered it, that's when it really mattered. Like the Vikings, great. The Vikings, discovered the New World, but nobody cared. I think it's the same thing, right? Like when he started talking about ghost hunting, that's when people started to think, oh, ghost hunting, that's really interesting. And the Warrens, obviously, those of you who are fans of the Conjuring universe and the Conjuring series know who the Warrens are. They are, without question, the most famous ghost hunters. Mr. Warren, I forget his first name, was a self-proclaimed demonologist, claimed to be one of the only certified demonologists in the United States. Don't know who certifies demonologists, but in any event, a lot of people have some fairly negative views of the Warrens, think they were basically con men, con people, I guess, but they're very famous. They collected a lot of haunted and paranormal things in their home. They had a museum, which included things like Annabelle. For those of you who've seen the movie Annabelle, they have the original doll in their house. They've both now passed away. But in any event, this was, I don't know what it was, like the late 1800s, early 1900s, you had this fascination with the occult, and you had all these mystics and all these people doing seances and all of their stuff. And then in the 60s and 70s, there was like a rebirth of that, right? Where everybody was into this sort of parapsychology, sort of bringing science to all that stuff. And these people were really involved in that. And so when they got an opportunity to look into something like the Amityville Horror, they were all over it.
In investigating the Amityville Horror, Holzer concludes that the house had actually been built on a Shinnecock Indian burial ground. How'd I do on pronunciation?
Perfect.
I don't know if it's perfect, but it's good, close enough. To be even more precise, the house had been built directly over the grave of an Indian chief named Rolling Thunder. And Holzer said that at some point, the chief's grave was uncovered and his skull was shattered. And that's when these hauntings began. Holzer believed that the spirit of the chief used DeFeo, who was a weak and wounded soul and who was easily possessed, to commit the atrocities at the house on Ocean Avenue.
And Hans wrote a whole book about this. So if you want to read Hans Holzer's take on this, he wrote a book on it. I think the second Amityville Horror movie was based on his book. So the first one's based on the Lutz's book about the haunting and their involvement. And then the second movie is based on Hans Holzer's book. And like I said, if you guys go back and you watch some of these documentaries that came out in the early 80s and early 90s, Hans is like, he's all over it, right? He's telling the story about this Indian chief and about, he tells the story that the chief was buried on his horse. So the chief's like riding his horse and somehow he gets dug up and his skull, some kid's like playing with a skull and he shatters the skull. And that's when all this started, right? That's when this haunting took place, and that DeFeo was just this particularly weak individual, and the chief could really use him. And then when the Lutzes moved in, the husband, Mr. Lutz, I don't know his first name, that he was interested in the occult and sort of had dabbled in that, and that allowed the chief once again to sort of exercise his influence and cause havoc. Now, there hasn't been any paranormal activity that we know about since the Lutzes moved out, but Hans will tell you that that's just because the right person is not there, and that eventually the right person will be there again, and you'll see this kind of paranormal activity manifest itself in Amityville once again.
So do you buy into the paranormal
Well, I can't get into the
story
theories yet. We got to do that later.
All right, I guess.
I mean, look, it's a weird case.
We started out with the paranormal, and you know how our it's aliens people don't like that.
Well, they're going to have to get over it on this one. So. And look,
I definitely will say, I mean, I get the creeps thinking about this case. And so the paranormal theories resonate because it is such a creepy story.
well, there's something about the murder of 6 people, the murder of 6 family members, that just feels like if anything was going to tear like a psychic hole in the universe, it's that, right? I mean, you totally can buy that if there was anything that was going to open up a way for the other side, or whatever you want to call it, to make itself known, it would be that. So I totally understand that. I totally get why people believe in this and think that there really was something paranormal going on that night. And look, there are weird things about this case, really weird things. And we've already talked about one of them, but we're going to talk about it some more. And that's the fact that no one woke up and that no one heard these shots. And it has to be one of the weirdest aspects of this story and one of the most inexplicable things. The fact that DeFeo killed his family for drug money is very understandable. As awful as it is, it's something that happens every day in this country, and that's a horrible thing to say, but it's true. And frankly, you know, the worse the violence, the more likely drugs are involved, right? But in this case, you have a guy firing a rifle. It is loud. This is a loud rifle. And the police have said there's no silencer used in this case. And even if there were, those of you who've actually ever fired a weapon with a silencer attached, it's still really loud. Really loud. It's not like it is in the movies. Well, Hans had an explanation for this. He believed that the spirit of Rolling Thunder, the Indian chief, was able to create some sort of psychic vortex. And I think those are his words, psychic vortex, that prevented sound from being heard, even that of a rifle blast. So essentially, it allows DeFeo to kill his family, and his family doesn't know because of this psychic vortex, and the neighbors don't hear it because of the psychic vortex. And you may think, what about the dog? So the psychic vortex prevents a gunshot from being heard, but it can't prevent the dog and its barking from being heard? Well, that's actually completely consistent, according to Hans, because dogs have this uniquely attuned connection to the spirit world. And it's actually not surprising that when the dog barks, that's the one thing that can get through this vortex and out into the world. So that's what Hans thought. And I don't know, Alice, do you buy that psychic vortex? Is that what you're going to side with in this case?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
I mean, it is something that needs to be explained, that none of them seem to have been awoken. It makes sense that they would be asleep at 3 a.m, but to not have a single person awake, it's not even that the family doesn't wake up. It's that the neighbors don't hear it. And I know when we talked about Ray Rivera, we talked about the helicopter, and I think I had mentioned that helicopter was unlikely because people would remember hearing a helicopter. And a lot of people wrote me and were like, no, you probably forget something like a helicopter. I don't think you would forget hearing 8 gunshots, though. I remember nights when I've woken up with fireworks, even when they were on holidays like July 4th, and you would expect to hear those sounds. But I have heard gunshots from my house before when I lived in an urban area, and it was many pops. It was very in quick succession. I remember the time of day, and I wasn't woken up by it, so maybe I was more alert. But I absolutely remember hearing gunshots, and I don't think that's something that you would forget.
And you certainly would remember it if the next day all your neighbors were dead, right? Like,
no,
even if you heard it and
absolutely.
you were like, I don't know what that is. The next morning when it's like, oh yeah, all the DeFeos are dead, you'd be like, huh, I thought I heard something.
I heard something.
You
Right.
know?
And for people to remember hearing a dog, but not hearing gunshots, that's even more surprising because they remember enough to have heard the dog, right? And the dog is a more commonplace sound than gunshots.
No, that's true. I mean, look, and I don't have any explanation for that. I can't explain why nobody heard the gun and they heard the dog. You know, people have said, well, it's probably muffled because of the house and stuff in the house and all this other stuff. I just don't believe that. And I certainly don't believe it if you could hear the dog. The dog was inside. The dog was in the kitchen. And yet you could hear the dog barking. Why couldn't you hear the gunshots? Now, it was 3:15 in the morning. So maybe there weren't that many people awake. Maybe the guy who heard the dog barking for whatever reason just didn't hear the gunshots. I don't know. I can't explain that. What I can say is there may be a more prosaic explanation for why the family did not wake up. You will often read, and we'll talk about why, that there was no evidence of any sedation administered to the DeFeo family. In fact, if you ever read anything that's like 8 weird things about the DeFeo murders, one of them will always be that there's no evidence of sedation. But that's not what the police said at the time. In fact, there was a New York Times article about this, and in that New York Times article, it reported that DeFeo had actually told the police during his initial confession, this is the same one with the money issues and whether he was doing it for money, that he had actually administered heavy doses of barbiturates to the family the night of the murders. He had put it into the family dinner that they were eating that night. Not sure what they were eating, but that was his explanation. So he had drugged them. So when they went to sleep, they were in a deep sleep and they weren't going to wake up. Now, the twist on this is that Dr. Howard Edelman, who is the person who actually performed the autopsies on the DeFeos, testified that they had no drugs in their system. And that fact has been repeated ad nauseum by him and by others to support the conclusion that the DeFeos were not drugged. Now, here's the thing, though. On the stand, Edelman was sort of forced to acknowledge that the toxicology tests in this case were not performed on the bodies until a full 2 weeks had passed. Now, I don't know the science on this, but I know there are many who speculate that those 2 weeks allowed these drugs to sort of dissipate, to break down, so that when they were tested, you didn't find the barbiturates. And Edelman testified that given these facts, it was possible they were drugged, but there was no way to prove it. And I would be interested, those of you out there who know a lot about toxicology, there are things that if you give to somebody and you dig them up 100 years later, you'll find. You know, you poison somebody with arsenic, you're gonna find it. It's a heavy element. That's why you find it. Don't know if that's true about barbiturates. Don't know if 2 weeks is enough time for them to sort of dissolve away. So I would be interested if anybody has any more insight on that, what your thoughts might be.
Yeah, and we have some really faithful listeners who have a lot of knowledge in this area, so we'd love to hear from you guys. My only thought about the body breaking down the barbiturates and dissipating after 2 weeks is typically that happens when your bodies are functioning, right? When there's blood flow, when there's oxygen, that the body can break it down. So this almost seems like if it were to dissipate it, it just like evaporates into the air. I mean, again, I'm no scientist, so I don't know the answer to this, but I would think it would be difficult to have absolutely no trace of a drug, even 2 weeks later.
I mean, I would think so as well. And look, Butch has said so many things and he's made so many different statements that it's hard to know whether you can even credit his statement that he had drugged them or not.
And the drugging thing is basically the only answer that would help explain in a non-paranormal way why they didn't wake up, at least to me. And so the fact that there isn't any scientific evidence of it is very confusing for me. There's another potential angle here. Now, even though we've told you that, Butch has confessed to this crime in a number of ways, but his story changes sometimes, there could be another story. If the DeFeos were not drugged, could there have actually been a second gunman, and that's how they were killed so quickly before they could wake up? So Dr. Edelman testified at trial that he could not imagine how one person could have committed the crimes. He expressed total mystification to police officers at the time of their investigation over the question. And when asked at trial if he was still mystified, he responded, "Yes. Forensics showed that all the family members had been killed in their beds. None of them had moved. It's also possible that they were simply so terrified that they froze." I mean, maybe, but...
I mean, I really can't explain it. And Edelman's interesting because, and this goes to what we were talking about a little bit in the Peterson case, right? Like, Edelman is the state forensics guy, but he's not necessarily saying things that the state wants him to say. He's saying what he thinks happened, and he's got some views that really kind of throw a wrench in the case. His view that they weren't drugged throws a wrench in the case. His view that DeFeo could not have done this alone throws a wrench in the case. Now, it doesn't mean that DeFeo is innocent, but it means that maybe the prosecution doesn't have the whole story. It means that maybe there's another murderer out there running around. And this total mystification thing is his statement. That's what Edelman said. And as far as I know, he never recanted that. Till his dying day, he believed it was impossible for DeFeo to have done this. Now, on the freezing thing, it's weird, but it's possible. I mean, the way these murders went down is DeFeo, he shoots his father twice with a rifle. He shoots his mother twice with a rifle. They're both dead. The house is 3 stories tall. Dawn's bedroom is on the top story. So hard to believe, but maybe she didn't hear it because she was up there or whatever, right? So you've got the youngest kids on the 2nd floor. They're pretty young. You could imagine them being sort of frozen, hearing this really loud noise, having no idea what's going on, and not moving. The only problem with that is you'd think they would sit up. You would think they would be like, "What's that?" You think they would, come down the stairs to mom and dad's room to ask what's going on. They don't do that. Some people have speculated, and this is also possible, and we just don't know what happened in that house, is that they did do that. That they had come down the stairs, and then their big brother, comes out of the parents' room and says, "It's okay, go back to bed." Right? And then at that point, they go back to bed, and then he kills the rest of them. I guess that's possible. Maybe that's the most likely thing, because it sort of explains why they didn't move. But it's strange. I mean, you can understand why Edelman had so much difficulty accepting this explanation. So look, I think that's enough horror, enough Amityville horror for one day. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up now. We got a lot more to talk about in this case. I mean, we still got, angry Indian chiefs to talk about, some weird stuff about, potential witnesses, including one who might have been in the DEA. which has caused all sorts of conspiracy theories. We're going to talk more about the mob. We're going to talk about Dawn. We haven't talked about Dawn a lot. We've talked about this possibility of a second gunman. We're going to talk about Dawn and whether or not she might have had some involvement in this. And then we'll sort of give you our theories, and we'll give you our theories about not only what happened in this case, but about whether or not the Amityville Horror itself was real. But that's all going to be tomorrow. Alice, do you have anything else? Any final thoughts? Any things you want to say to our loyal, lovely listeners?
No, but I hope you're enjoying this, because this one still gives me chills, and there's more to talk about tomorrow.
This is a creepy one.
This is super creepy.
This is a perfect one for the October season, the Halloween time of year. But look, thank you guys for all your reviews that you've been leaving, all those 5-star reviews. They make us very happy. They warm our hearts in this cold, dark season. If you have any thoughts, any questions, any comments, if you want to explain to us what happens to barbiturates in a dead body over 2 weeks, shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Prosecutorspodcast.com is our website. You can also find us on Reddit. You can find us on YouTube. You find us all over the place. So let us know what you think, and get ready, because the Amityville Horror isn't over. Not yet. And we will continue it tomorrow. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. This.
So ready.
Were you born ready?
No, it takes a lot of effort to get this ready.
Yeah. Glad you're this ready. Okay. All right. Stretch stuff.
Is it like an Olympic event?
I don't know. Well,
It could be. You don't know. That was really good. Ronald Defoe Jr., who's called Butch by his friends, burst into Henry's...
DeFeo, by the way.
Dang it. Okay, let me start over. What did I say?
You said Defoe. It's DeFeo.
Did I say Defoe? Man, in my head I said DeFeo. Okay, I'm gonna start over. Thanks for being so understanding.